Okay, good morning, everyone. Today is, I'm looking up the date, September the 29th, and this is an elections briefing with the Ways and Means Committee. I will start with some brief opening remarks, and then we will go right into the briefing, as I'm sure the committee, having just come off a primary election, has plenty of questions that they'd like to get in before the general election. The July primary election was Maryland's first statewide election since the pandemic. Despite some challenges, the election was generally successful. Mail-in voting continues to be far more popular with voters than before the pandemic. However, mail-in voting decreased significantly this year compared to 2020, and the large majority of voters continue to prefer in-person voting. I actually prefer going on the actual day myself. Consequently, it is essential that we provide convenient and accessible voting opportunities for both in-person voters and mail-in voters for future elections. Today, we will explore what worked well and what can be improved in the state's election process. An operation as large and complex as a statewide election will never be perfect, but we must do everything we can to empower every voter to cast their ballot and have it counted. In this year's election, there were several problems that should be corrected for future elections. Some voters received their mail-in ballots too late. The counting of mail-in ballots was delayed until after Election Day, a problem that fortunately, hopefully will not occur in the general election if the recent court ruling stands. Some voters received mailings with incorrect information about their election districts or assigned polling places. In some counties, a significant number of election polling places were closed in violation of state law, including my county, Howard County, making it harder for voters to reach the polls and access same-day registration. In 2 counties, errors in the mail-in or provisional ballot canvases were discovered and subsequently corrected. I look forward to an informative discussion of all these issues with our state and local administrators. And I will begin by thanking them before we get into it with Stan Ward, by thanking our state and local election officials for all their hard work during these challenging times. During the primary election was a very difficult and challenging election with lots of moving parts. So I do want to thank them for all of their hard work and work around the clock, I'm sure. So with that, we will begin with our very own Stan the Man Ward for some data for us. Stan, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm going to share some data with you that will provide some context for the discussion today. So I have a PowerPoint, there's 8 slides. Most of them have to do with turnout and one of them has to do with polling places. I think the presentation is coming up now. So are we ready to begin? I think we're ready to begin. Okay, so next slide, please.
Sorry, 1 second.
No problem.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're back up and running here, Stan.
Okay, could we go to the next slide, please? Great, thank you. So when we're looking at turnout, we're going to be comparing comparable elections. So this first slide has to do with gubernatorial primary elections. So if you look at this slide, you can see that actually the election we just had in July had the highest turnout of any gubernatorial primary election in recent years. So 27% of voters participated. The next highest was 25% back in 2010. Next slide, please. So this looks at gubernatorial general elections, and the last gubernatorial general election was in 2018, of course. That had 59% turnout, which was actually pretty high. The next highest was 54% in 2010, and in 2014, it was 47% turnout, which was quite low. Next slide, please. So this slide looks at presidential primary elections. So of course, the last presidential primary election we had was in 2020. And as you may recall, that was conducted almost entirely by mail because of the pandemic. So that election had 42% turnout. That was basically the same as in 2016, which also had 42% turnout. And that was less than in 2008, which actually saw 43% turnout. The outlier is the 2012 primary election, which had only 19% turnout, which is the lowest turnout of any Maryland election in recent years. Next slide, please. So this looks at presidential general elections, which of course have the highest turnout. In 2020, the general election turnout was 75%. That was slightly higher than in 2016 when the turnout was 72%. It was about the same as in 2012, which had 74% turnout, and it was less than in 2008, which actually saw 78% turnout. And of course, as you recall, the general election in 2020 was conducted in a hybrid format. About half of voters participated by mail and about half in person. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting slide. It shows significant change in the past few years because it looks at the percentage of votes cast by mail. So as you can see, prior to the pandemic, the percentage of votes cast by mail was pretty low. It was typically about 5%. And it goes way up during the pandemic. Of course, the primary election, as we just mentioned, in 2020 was conducted almost entirely by mail. The general election, as I said, had a hybrid format. All voters were mailed a mail-in ballot application, so they could choose to use that to participate by mail, or they could show up at the polls during early voting or on election day. And as I mentioned, about half of voters voted by mail in that election and about half in person. And then in this year's primary election, again, all voters were mailed a mail-in ballot application. In the end, about a third of voters chose to vote by mail, and the rest voted in person. So obviously the mail-in voting is much higher than it was before the pandemic, but significantly lower in this year than it was in 2020. So next slide, please. So this looks at the percentage of votes cast during early voting, and this is in-person early voting. So as you can see in the recent primary election, 17% of the vote was cast during early voting. And that is actually lower than it's been typically in recent elections. In recent elections, the percentage of votes cast early has been between 26% and 32%. The exceptions are the 2020 primary when there was no early voting, and the 2016 primary when about 18% of the vote was cast early. Next slide, please. So this slide drills down a little bit on turnout in the recent primary election in July, and it breaks down that turnout by method of voting. So as you can see from the chart, voting on election day in your assigned precinct in person continues to be the most popular choice by far. 46% of voters chose to participate that way. Voting in person early, 17% of voters chose to participate that way. And then 4% of voters voted provisionally. Those are also in-person voters. So the total in-person turnout was 67% of the total turnout, so the large majority. And then 33% voted by mail. So again, much higher than before the pandemic. Next slide, please. So this slide is about polling places, and it's showing the change in the number of polling places in each county in 2022 compared to 2018 before the pandemic. So as you can see, if you look over on the left, Allegheny County, for example, there was no change. The number of polling places in 2022 was the same as in 2018, so no change. In Anne Arundel County, the number of polling places in 2022 was 7% less than in 2018. In Baltimore City, the polling places in 2022 was 4% less than in 2018, and so forth. In 3 counties, the number of polling places actually increased: Baltimore County, Garrett County, and Prince George's County. In a number of counties, as you can see, the number of polling places did not change, but also in quite a few counties, the number of polling places declined. In some counties, they declined significantly. Particularly Somerset County, there was a 45% decline in the number of polling places. In St. Mary's County, a 28% decline. In Howard County, a 30% decline. In Charles County, a 28% decline. And in Carroll County, a 27% decline. Statewide, the number of polling places declined by 3% compared to 2018. And that concludes my presentation. And if I can answer any questions, I'm happy to do so.
Thank you, Stan. Are there any questions for Stan? And just a reminder, if you remember where it is, please use the raise your hand function. Otherwise, if you try to flag me down, hopefully I'll see you. Any questions for Stan before we move on? Delegate Patterson?
Good morning, all. Stan, regarding the decline in polling places, is it because of redistricting? I know in Charles County it's like 28% because of the boundary changes. Is that the cause?
I think that the state and local boards will address the causes. I'm not aware of exactly what drove the changes in the number of polling places in each county. Obviously, in some counties it went up, some it went down, and some it stayed the same. So if you don't get the answer today, perhaps contact your local election director to get more.
I will. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much, Stan. And now welcome Linda Lamone and Nikki Charleston from the State Board of Elections. And whenever you two are ready, you can take it away. I think Ms. Lamone is going to go first.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see everybody. Hope you're having a good election season. We are very busy, as you can imagine. I'm not quite sure who all of my staff is here, but as you said, Nikki is here, Donna Duncan, who is a long-term employee, Melissa Dorsey. Who else is on, Nikki?
Jared and Jen.
Oh, right. Thank you. To begin, I'd like to also recognize the election officials across the state for successfully administering this election. It certainly had its challenges with a changed election date, shorter than usual time to implement the redistricting plans, and a return to a normal, as Stan pointed out, election with a significant increase in the number of mail-in ballots. As you all are aware, all elections require a tremendous amount of work, but this one required even more than the normal. And Maryland's election officials, both at the state board and at the local boards of elections, did what was necessary to administer the election successfully. And I'd like to publicly thank them for doing their service and their dedication, and their family for supporting their work. Before providing the requested information, a brief overview of the 2022 primary election. As I stated and Stan has pointed out, we returned to our normal process. That is, the voters could vote in person during early voting or on election day, or they could vote by mail. Before the election, there was much discussion about how the voters would participate in the mid-July election. And as also Stan pointed out, when all the votes were received and counted, over 26% of eligible voters voted, which was the second highest turnout in the last 5 gubernatorial elections. Excuse me. The interesting thing was to observe the percentage of voters voting during early voting. And it's a significant decrease from past years, and it's the lowest percentage since the 2012 primary election. Daily turnouts during trends during early voting mirrored prior elections. The busiest days were the final 2 days, and almost over 78,000 voters voted, but the slowest 2 days, as usual, were Saturday and Sunday. Again, Stan, thank you. The vote by mail turnout prior to the 2020 election was between 6 and 8% of total turnout. About 35% voted by mail in this last election. we sent out over almost 500,000 packets to voters who requested them, and about 70% of those were returned. Although the use of the ballot drop-off boxes was less than the inaugural 2020 election, the boxes were still popular, with over 44% of mail-in voters using one of the 287 drop boxes across the state. As you all know, this election was not without its challenges. A delay in the census data resulted in a delay in the redistricting process. In order to accommodate the redistricting process, the election date was changed from June to July, and this resulted in a lot of issues for the local boards. They were implementing the redistricting process while simultaneously addressing all the challenges associated with the date change, including the availability of voting locations and election judges. Plus, they were performing the usual pre-election activities, processing a significant increase in mail-in ballots requests. We also had to deal with supply chain issues, with the shortages of envelopes and iVoter stickers for mail-in ballot packets being the most difficult to overcome. As we did for the 2020 election, we are, thanks to Nikki primarily and her merry gang, we're going to be issuing a comprehensive report on the 2022 primary election. The report will contain information that you have heard or will be hearing today, and more detailed information about election preparation for the general election. And we're hoping to have it out tomorrow, and we'll of course provide you all a link to it, but it'll be in our press room, online press room. So we were asked to provide data on 4 topics. That information has been provided in the written response that you all got earlier. The first one was the permanent mail-in list, the timing of return of mail-in ballots, the consolidation of polling places, and the usage of ballot marking device. So I know all of these are addressed in the materials that have been sent to you and will be addressed by the local boards of elections that are here today to brief you on their activities. So we can take questions now, Madam Chair, or we can wait until after everybody is presented.
Thank you, Ms. Lamone. Did Ms. Charleston, are you here just for questions, or did you want to say something?
I'm just here to answer questions later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see Delegate Wilkins has her hand raised.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I want to start by thanking our election officials from across the state who worked so hard to ensure that we were able to transition in terms of the date, redistricting, and just so many challenges. So just kudos and many thanks to our hardworking election officials. Director Lamone, I was a little disappointed to not hear some of the answers to the questions that we asked you about ahead of time. You mentioned some materials that were shared, but this is a public briefing where we want the public to also hear this information. So if you're able to please respond with some at least top line data and information regarding the questions that we asked. I'm not finding it as helpful to just let us know that the materials were sent to us. So if you're able to please share some of the top lines based on some of what we requested, that would be really helpful.
Absolutely. And I think Nikki is more than prepared to do that, Delegate, and I'll turn it over to her and her staff that have the details.
Great. Good morning. Thank you. Nikki Charleston, State Board of Elections. So one of the things that we were asked to cover was the permanent mail-in ballot list. So this was a new legislative initiative. And so anytime anybody asked for a mail-in ballot, they had the option of asking for it for just the primary and the general, or for all elections moving forward. So that would include all federal and state elections, county elections, not municipal elections. And so as of election day, We had over 325,000 voters of the about 500,000 that had requested a ballot were on the permanent list. And about, 221,000 of them voted and returned a ballot. And what was interesting is about 11,000 of them voted their mail-in ballot and their provisional ballot. So it looks like we have a little education to do to make sure, do people understand what they're asking for? Or did they just change their mind? We did mail out, or we did communicate with everybody on that list before the election, reminding them that they were on that list, giving them the option to update their information or to withdraw from the list. We received some good feedback on that, and we've changed the way that form looks for the general. So we're interested to see whether those numbers change. But we'll be watching that number for the general election to see how many of our permanent mail-in voters are also wanting to vote in person and voting a provisional. In terms of the timing of the return of mail-in ballots, so about 67% of the ballots that we sent out were received. That's statewide. Attached to our written submission is a table for the whole state. It does vary by county, but overall it was 67% of the ballots that we sent were returned, which is not, in a primary election, we generally see a lower return rate than we do in a general election. And that's one big driver of that is the fact that we have unaffiliated and third-party voters who ask for a ballot, have a ballot, and when they get it, it's only in some county school board. And so they decide, okay, I don't want to vote. That wasn't what they were expecting, and they don't return that ballot. We have a table in our materials showing the percent of mail-in ballots processed by week. Ballots went in the mail sort of the early, maybe mid-June. So those first couple weeks in the chart, you'll see not very many ballots returned because they were still in the process of getting into voters' hands. The cadence of the return is the closer you get to election day, the more ballots that are received, right? Which is what we would expect. And that's what the numbers show statewide. With the busiest week, almost 30% of the mail-in ballots that were returned the week of the election. The third topic we were asked to address was consolidation of polling places. And so Stan showed a graph of that. We are displaying it in a table form with the actual numbers of polling places in 2018 and the number of polling places in 2020, and asked to break those into two buckets. How many of the decrease were consolidation within a building? So maybe in 2018, the polling place had a polling place in the gym and a polling place in the library. And in 2022, they just moved everybody into the gym. And then the second bucket is just a complete change of building. And so the chart shows how many of those were in the consolidation within a building and how many were moved to a new building. Just think, it's also, I do believe that Katie Berry from Carroll County is going to be talking about what her experience in Carroll County. I think it's just important to note a couple reasons for the changing of the buildings. One is we are fortunate that many of our local boards have access to and use senior centers or assisted living facilities or continuing care retirement communities as polling places. They serve that community very well. But in the midst of the pandemic, while these buildings and facilities were willing to serve, there was an important caveat in that if there was a COVID-19 outbreak, that they would not be able to serve. And so that obviously would have been a last minute change. And so many local boards decided not to use those facilities because they couldn't risk being told a week before election day that that facility was not available. So that's one of the reasons. Another was some of the the facilities just weren't available when the date changed. I know that, for example, Montgomery County worked very hard with their Board of Education to defer maintenance on facilities so that they could have an election on June 28th. And then when it was moved, it was too late to make any adjustments. But Allison McLaughlin is also here to talk about that if you wish. And then the third is just the building just wasn't available. That sometimes will happen. A facility that has served for a while has declined to serve for any number of reasons. And so the local board must find something else if there is one or consolidate. So just wanted to highlight that those are some of the reasons. Again, some of the local boards that are here can provide more details about specific locations. And then the fourth thing we were asked to cover was the usage of ballot marking devices. And about a third of our voters who voted in person used the ballot marking device. This is an increase of about 6% from the 2020 general. Obviously, comparing to 2020 primary is not really super helpful, but we are seeing an increase in the usage of those devices. There were several counties where more than 40% of voters used those, and we've listed those counties in there that are seeing a higher usage. So we're just continuing to monitor the usage of those devices. And at yesterday's state board meeting, a couple counties asked to deploy a few more. We have inventory for that, and the state board approved those requests because those are jurisdictions that are seeing an increased use in at least those particular precincts or at those early voting centers. I think those are the 4 topics that we were asked to cover, and I'm happy to answer any questions either now or at the end.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, if it's okay, that was just me trying to get the actual presentation that we're looking for. I also have just 2 questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So thank you so much, Ms. Charleston and Administrator Lamone. I do want to check in about a personal experience that I had. I am a permanent mail-in ballot voter, which I've been really excited about and was glad to lead that bill along with members of this committee. But I did notice, and I was concerned that I dropped my ballot off in the drop box on July 11th. And it wasn't even marked as received until the 26th. This is also a question that I'm going to be asking our Montgomery County election director to comment on as well. But I want to understand from the state level what we can do to make sure that we have more timely responses, the communication between the local system and the state system so that we can get our updates. Even as someone who worked closely on this issue, I began to feel very concerned that my ballot wasn't even marked as received by the board. So if you can comment on sort of the communication system and how it works and how we can speed that up and be a little bit more timely for the general election.
Sure. So it's all the same system. So once the local board scans the barcode that is on the outside of that envelope into the central system, then the status flips to received. And then that night we grab that data and start sending the emails. So I know that Ms. McLaughlin is planning to talk about that and the internal process of receiving those ballots, receiving in quotes, because that's what we use the verb processed in our statement and explained what that means in a footnote. But once it's in the system, we are grabbing it every night and sending those out. So the volume of mail-in ballots was obviously a large number this year, and it took some time to receive those. And so I think that Allison is prepared to talk about that as well. So I'm happy to circle back at the end after Allison talks if you'd like more information, but it's one system. They're accessing the same system that we are accessing to grab and generate the emails.
Okay, thank you for that information. I'll just ask that other presenters, if you have any additional thoughts or comments on that, to please include it. My final question deals with the ballot marking devices. I believe that in this 2022 primary, that this was the first time, given some challenges and the settlement regarding our voters who are blind, that there was a more maybe aggressive attempt to ensure that there was equal and more widely available use of the ballot marking devices. And one of the challenges that we saw in Montgomery County is that all of the voters, all of the candidates, I should say, for a race were not on the same page. So I'm a W last name. So let's say there were 10 candidates in my race. I might be on the second page as opposed to the main page. And then in addition to that, that second page did not even include what race I might be running for. And that was a huge challenge and potentially a disadvantage to someone who is on the second page, whose race they're in is not even listed. And I would like to know, because this was something that was flagged in previous elections, why this issue has not been fixed. What is the timeline for fixing it to at least display up to 14 candidates? I think it's absolutely critical for us to have a fair election, that candidates have the equal opportunity in terms of how they are listed on the ballot.
So a couple things. So the statement that the election judges say at check-in is the same statement that's been used for a couple elections, and it was part of an effort to ensure that there's secrecy of the ballot for the voters that use it. You're right, the use is increasing. The statements remain the same. And so it's been an effort just to portray both options neutrally as part of our settlement of the National Federation of the Blind. But we have been looking at, there is a software update that we can do to the ballot marking devices, and it's the entire system. And when we did a thorough review of that, there were some other changes in that software upgrade that negatively impacted our ability to conduct elections. And so it was a hard decision to make, knowing that there were benefits. As with anything, there were benefits and then there were offsetting risks. And so we decided in 2021, I think, not to upgrade the voting system because some of the other changes negatively impacted how we prepared for an election. This is a software that's used across the country, and so it's not designed just for us. And some of their changes the vendor made, negatively impacted how we prepare. So we do have an opportunity to upgrade the system for the 2024 election. That will be our last election using the system. And so we will be evaluating the newest version of the software that our vendor has to determine whether we will implement that before the 2024 elections. But we certainly understand the concerns about how the candidates' names are displayed. There's additional signage at every booth for instructions. The sample ballots also include information on how to use the how to use the ballot marking device and navigate through. But we understand that the candidates' concerns about in a contest with more than 7 candidates, how those names are displayed on multiple screens. Just lastly, I'd like to note that we have set up the system in such a way that voters have to look at every screen in a contest. They can't just make a selection on screen 1 and then advance to the next contest. They must view all of the screens associated with that contest. And that is a setting that we've had turned on since we've been using this system.
So, Ms. Charleston, after several, it was okay, this is my little follow-up. After several years of knowing this challenge and this issue, there's absolutely no solution after, I believe it's been at least 4 years, that you've been able to find with the vendor where we would allow and enable a fair listing of the candidates, at the very least, the race that someone is running for. I just find it very difficult to understand why this is something that we're unable to find any solution for, and that you're naming 2024 at this point.
Well, it's not customized software just for us. It's a software platform that they build for customers all over the country. And so they are adding other things that, as I said, that when we looked at it, that would really impact our ability to prepare ballots on time and be ready for an election. And so it's the one system that we have that we don't get to customize. All of the others we do, but because the voting system is a federally certified software and a system that the vendors generally don't do customizations for one particular vendor because it's very expensive for them to move through the federal certification process. I hear you. I understand. It's the one system, however, that we just really can't customize like all of the others.
Okay, we have a few more hands up. We'll go to Delegate Feldmark, then Delegate Plakovich-Carr. Delegate Feldmark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have a few questions, and I do want to thank the Board of Elections, both the state board and the local election officials. I know you have been working very hard to keep up with all the changes. And I hope we can continue working hard and do a little better moving forward. I guess I am concerned about the consolidation of polling places. One, because it is in violation of the legislation that we adopted last session. And also because limiting the number of polling places ends up disenfranchising some people. And so I appreciate the breakdown of the sort of two types of consolidation or two types of elimination, one being consolidation within a building. What you've labeled as building change, I think even that title is a little misleading. That sounds like it's sort of a net zero. We move from one building to a neighboring building, but we actually saw a decrease and an elimination in the number of polling places. So, and I'll ask the local officials to speak more to the reasoning and the rationale, but for the state board, I guess my question is, what are you doing from the state level to address this, right? How was the mandate communicated, and what is being done to improve compliance moving forward?
So we discussed this both at election directors meetings and in individual conversations with the local boards. And the Mayo, the Maryland Association of Election Officials, is an active participant in legislation, and I'm sure that you heard from some of them. We were all aware of what the requirement was. And again, I think that the local boards can provide you with specific examples. I tried to generally categorize what we were hearing as the reasons why they were running out of facilities. So everybody was aware of what the requirement was. And I think just some of the practical reality of the world in which they were operating made it such that they did their best to comply. And there were times when they had to move to another facility because the one they had just wasn't available to them.
And will at least some of those be corrected for the general?
The state board has approved a few polling place changes going back to where they were. There were a couple that were unconsolidated, but I think for the most part, they are moving facilities and not unconsolidating. The ones that the state board approved, which was, the state board has to approve them now because it's within a certain period of time.
Right. Okay, thank you. Another issue I wanted to raise was what continues to be referred to as a voter registration deadline. And with same-day registration, we really don't have a deadline. And we dealt with this issue during the primary, and unfortunately, it was during early voting that a correction to the website was made. But I do appreciate you know, working with us to correct that. But if a voter goes to the website and clicks on register to vote after the deadline, then they were taken to a page that said voter registration is closed. Voter registration will reopen, I think it said the first week of August, right? With no information about the fact that they could still register to vote at an early voting center or on election day at their polling place. So we did get that language corrected. We got a note up about same-day registration, but I'm still concerned about referring to this as a deadline without, you know, reminding people that same-day registration is available. It's really only a deadline for online registration, or for registration to be on the voter rolls so that you don't have to vote a provisional ballot at the polling place, right? And I realize that that clarification is a little wordy, but I'm concerned that in trying to be concise, we're giving people the impression they may be missing an opportunity to vote when really they have the opportunity to vote. So I'm wondering what we can do about that.
So we'll go through our website again and add that nuance everywhere. We did add a slide on the homepage and we did change the message. And those will continue. So we'll go through and just make sure there aren't any other references that we need to clean up.
Thank you. And then my final question, you did provide, thank you, a detailed breakdown county by county on mail-in ballots, you know, sent, received, accepted, and rejected. I'm just wondering, in the comprehensive report that is coming out very shortly, will that include a breakdown of reasons for why ballots were rejected? Or if not, can you provide that separately, please?
There's some information in the report. We also have a report on our website that shows all of the rejection reasons and the number. So we can provide you with the link to that report on the website.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Plakovich-Carr, then Delegate Ebersol.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Two questions. First, I heard from a number of constituents leading up to the primary election who had requested a mail-in ballot, but who didn't receive it, or in some cases, the ballot came after the primary election date. Has the board looked into what the causes were for these missing ballots? You know, was this an issue with the mail vendor, with the post office, something else? And do you have plans that you're putting in place for the general election to try to prevent this issue from happening again?
So Jen McLaughlin's on here. If I will just take a stab at it, and then Jen, if you want to add anything. So we were tracking all of the ballots going out and tracking through the post office, and we're seeing a 3 to 5 day delivery period. So once it leaves the mail house and enters the mail stream, we have less control. So if you have those voters' names, we are happy to track and see where the last point in the system we can see them. But we did confirm that ballots, files that we sent to the vendor did result in a ballot going in the mail. But if you have any specific information, we're happy to look into that and to see if there was a unique situation happening with that voter. Jen, oh, sorry.
I didn't know.
Sorry.
Go ahead. You can
I
finish.
was pausing to see if Ms. McLaughlin was going to add anything. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I'll just add that it was a number of folks, and in their cases, they went to the local board of elections. They had been told their ballot was sent, and they just never received that ballot. And that ballot ended up being canceled by the local board. I also wanted to ask about the outreach that maybe the board is planning for future elections in terms of the permanent mail-in ballot list. I believe last February, there was a mailing that went out to registered voters, letting people know that they could opt in to that permanent list or just request the one election's worth of mail-in ballots. I think that was a really helpful piece that let a lot of people know about the change in law and the new option there. Is that something that the board plans to repeat for upcoming elections?
Jen, do you want to take that?
Sure, certainly. That the sending out the application forms will be repeated in 2024.
Great, thank you.
Delegate Ebersol and then Delegate Long.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for your hard work. In particular, they're not on, so I'll say the Baltimore County Board of Elections was really responsive to my phone calls because I was being shifted from district to district, and initially there were some things that needed to be fixed up. One of the things that did happen was I have an anecdotal example of this, and I think it happened probably a little more often than I believe. A precinct in Baltimore County was cut into 2 precincts because the precinct, the newly assigned precinct was in a different district. A number of people got ballots mailed to them that were from their previous district and therefore their previous precinct. I want to know if this was widespread, if you know about it. Did people send in, they were sent corrected ballots, I believe, but did they send in the incorrect ballots and what was done with them? I have a number of questions about that. Ultimately, I can see on the voter file that they have been corrected. They are in the correct precinct now, but I think they didn't get fixed. And I was curious at what level that happened and what was done about it.
Melissa, do you want to take that?
Sure. We did identify, sorry, Melissa Dorsey with the State Board. We performed an audit of the redistricting shortly after the local boards completed it, but as Linda alluded to, obviously we had a very short time to do it. So we had originally sent out our first round of mail-in ballots to voters, and they had received them prior to the audit being completed. So we did the audit, identified some redistricting errors that needed to be corrected, made those corrections and communicated that with the voters who did get a correct ballot. They also received all of the updated information that they would get when they were originally changed and a letter informing them of what had happened. Playing it forward a little bit in terms of, we did tell them to vote the most recent ballot that they had, get rid of any ballot they had before that. And we provided the local boards with information for canvassing in terms of which ballot to count if they received both ballots. And in one instance, we did have some support go out to some of the local boards to help with canvassing to make sure that those were being followed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your answer.
Delegate Long and then Delegate Guyton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had some questions about what happened in Baltimore City. There was 11 USB drives that turned up missing and then they found them. I find that really disturbing, given how the chain of evidence is passed from one person to the other. Has any investigation been launched to find out what happened to those 11 USB drives?
Yes, thank you for the question. We asked the Baltimore City Board of Elections to respond. And the vast majority of them, they either had in a different bag. So each local board asked their election judges to return supplies in specific bags for ease of, so they know where to look for things they need election night and when things that they can look for the next day. And I think they had 8. We have a letter from them, which we can share with you. They had possession of several of them. They were just put in a different bag. And so they didn't find them that night. There were a handful that were left in the machines overnight and secured. And when they were there the next day, they were able to find them. So I'm happy to share that the letter that they sent to us explaining what happened to all of the thumb drives, but they were securely stored, just not in the container that the local Board of Elections looked for them in that night. They get lots of supplies back election night, and sometimes they go through them the following day, and that's when they found some of those thumb drives.
If I could follow up with a question. Given what happened with the thumb drives, are they treated differently and held separately and counted differently treated, in other words, is a process treated differently since they have left the chain of custody? And what assurance do we have that the thumb drives that you received were actually the ones that come out of the machines?
So there's a couple checks. So the ones that were left in the machines, the local board knows that they were left in there. They were under locked, they were sealed. So they know that the ones that they pulled out of the voting units were the ones that they put in before election time. The system is also designed to only recognize thumb drives that it's created. So if you took another thumb drive and tried to load it in the system wouldn't accept it because it didn't create it. So there is an inherent check that when a thumb drive is inserted, that it is in fact one that the system itself has created. And there's always the option to rescan ballots, right? We have their source documents. It's one of the benefits of having paper ballots is that you can rescan them and generate results if you need to do that.
All right, thank you.
Delegate Guyton and then Delegate Jones.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for calling this hearing and this briefing. And I appreciate the Board of Elections for being here with us. My question is a little bit different. I know that the mail-in ballots, the paper mail-in ballots haven't been received yet, but I also was informed yesterday that the emailed ballots have been received by folks as of last night, at least some people. So I have a question about the emailed mail-in ballots versus the actual mailed mail-in ballots. There were some questions about that. I see that most of the mail-in ballots have been accepted during the primary, but there's a significant number that were not. I wonder if that tends to be the emailed ballots that are sent back in, and if you can address some confusion that people had because they had participated in mail-in ballots before, but when they printed out their email ballots, they didn't know if they needed to sign the back of their envelope, how much postage they needed to attach to that. So what reasons would an email ballot be rejected if it was sent in by mail? And what happens if there is not enough postage on that?
So the reasons that an electronically delivered mail-in ballot would be rejected are exactly the same as the reasons of any other ballots. So we can dig into that and provide you with any differences in the rejection rates for those. And your second question was about postage. So we do encourage, we don't always know how much weight that's going to be. So do encourage voters to take it to the post office and put a stamp on it. But I do believe that if the voter prints it with the election logo, the post office is likely to deliver that and charge the local board for that. But we do try to, when people can ask many times throughout that process for emailing, we let people know that they need to be able to print it. They're going to have to pay for postage. So we try to let people know when they're asking for the ballot, the consequences of asking for an electronic ballot. And if they change their mind, we can convert them over as long as there's time to get one in the mail. We can convert it over to a ballot that we can send by mail.
Thank you so much. I have one follow-up question. What percentage of the ballots received during the primary were electronic versus actual physical ballots? And my sense of things is that more people are asking for the electronic ballots because of the timeline issues that we ran into last time that have already been pointed out by my colleagues. Do you expect that to be an issue?
We about 12% of our ballots that we sent were electronic. I think that's a little higher than 2020 general, but I don't know that we have enough data in this new world of increased mail-in voting to show whether this is going to be continuing to increase. But we have tried to, again, as I said, throughout the whole process, let people know if you get it electronically, these are the things that you'll have to do.
Okay, Delegate Jones and then Delegate Branch.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman, and thanks to the members of the State Board of Elections. My question is regarding the processing of mail-in ballots. For clarification for myself, as many of my constituents asked this question, and those who are listening today, how many mail-in ballots are received by the local boards before the start of early voting? So not how many are received before Election Day, but how many are received before the start of early voting when they could be processed? That's my question.
So for the primary election, so early voting started the 7th to the 14th, I think. So it based on the percentages by week, it was before early voting, it was probably less than a quarter of the ballots, less than a third of the ballots that were ultimately received were received before the start of early voting.
Does that answer your question, Delegate Jones?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Okay, Delegate Branch.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So my Delegate Long actually already asked a question that I had, but I wanted to ask to piggyback on what missing. How can we ensure that that process is better? How can we ensure that the transition of collecting flash drives are accounted for every night before before leaving that night? And then the second thing is when they are coming up missing, how come we don't get reports of saying when they've been found? We have to literally write the Board of Elections to find out what happened to the actual lost flash drive. That's my first question. So will there be anything set in place to be able to not have this happen again?
So I was having a little trouble hearing. So if I didn't hear your question completely, let me know. So I think the question was, what are we going to do differently for the general with respect to the thumb drives and making sure that we have them all and they're all loaded election night. So that was one of the questions that we asked the Baltimore City Board of Elections. It's a training issue. So they are going to emphasize that in their training of their judges to make sure that they're removing the thumb drives and putting them in the designated location so that that election night, they can pull them right out and find them and work to just emphasize in training and make sure that they can track where they are. So if they have to find them the next day, that they know where they are and that they are in their custody. So it is something that they're working on and will continue to do so. And I will begin happy to share the letter that they provided with us to the committee. And I'm sorry, if there was another part of your question, I didn't hear it.
So my other question is that on election day, we've experienced a lot of people who were, I guess, on the lines of the redistricting. Some of them were being turned away at the polls because they did not have the correct ballot for them. How can we ensure that in November that we're not going to have the same issue and those who want to come and vote can actually vote in their respective polling places?
So the issues that were caused, as Melissa talked about with redistricting, we've done the audits, the local boards have corrected them. And so in terms of delivering the ballots out, I think that was the question, right? Are you saying that the polling place didn't have the right ballots?
They didn't have the right ballots and they were shown that they weren't in the right district as well.
Okay, so the corrections to the districts have been made and the voters, if they were incorrect, have received a new voter registration card. And if they're polling would have their correct election day polling place. So the voter part of that has been fixed and they have been notified. And when they get their sample ballot in the mail, that will include the correct information in both the location as well as the content of the ballot.
Okay, and what's been done with those who had received the wrong ballots that, what happened with those who received the wrong ballot during the last election? How can we ensure that those people actually voted for the people who they were supposed to vote for.
So Melissa, do you want to talk about how we work to get them the right ballots?
Sure. We made sure where there had been a change where someone voted, say at, school A, but they were now in school going to vote for school B. We made sure that both school A and B had ballots for both locations. So they were able to vote a provisional ballot if they showed up at the wrong location. So they should not have been turned away. They just should have had to have voted a provisional ballot at the time. Did that answer your question?
Not really, but thank you.
Okay, Delegate Patterson.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you also for the board for answering the question regarding the decline in polling places. I'm going to go outside and talk about the drop boxes. My question is, and we've heard this through the campaign, why is it necessary to have a no electioneering boundary around drop boxes when voters have already voted and the ballots are sealed? But yet there is no electioneering, and whether or not, in terms of the state law, because we know there's no requirement for no electioneering boundary around drop boxes. Thank you.
So it's a good question and one that we are looking into. We had advice from the 2020 election that they would have the same no electioneering zone as a voting location. But for the reasons that you've articulated, we are looking at whether we need to preserve that about 100-foot line around a ballot box.
Does that answer your question, Delegate Patterson?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. I don't see any other hands up. I just have a couple of questions based on all of the questions and comments that have been made before we move on to our local boards. Oh, I see Delegate Wilkins. Your hand is up.
Yes, I just had a suggestion for the board. I just pulled up my email regarding being a permanent mail-in ballot voter. And I appreciate per the legislation that we passed that there's notice sent and that you're checking my address to make sure it's the right address and the method in which I would like to receive my ballot. But I wanted to suggest and request that there's a little bit more detail in explaining to people what that is. I understand what a permanent mail-in voter is, but perhaps the average voter who signed up for this a year ago getting this email, us explaining this means that your ballot will be mailed to you or emailed to you or whatever method that they chose, and making it clear that they don't need to request one, they shouldn't go and try to vote. And also reminding people that the election, this is a missed opportunity to remind someone the election is on November 8th. So I just wanted to suggest I think it would be really helpful to make this email a tad bit more explanatory for people. I think that their voters, when I'm talking to voters, they're asking, why is there another election in November? They just voted in July. So sending this message without a little bit more context and reminding them that this means that their ballot is going to be sent to them. I think we need to make sure that we make it a little bit more clear. So just wanted to make that suggestion and I'll also follow up. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Delegate Wilkins. So a couple of just brief comments or questions. First, I want to piggyback on what Delegate Patterson said around the drop boxes. And I noticed out in Howard County, the drop boxes were not necessarily located near the entrance if they were at a school where the folks who were voting would go in. So a lot of times when we're out there campaigning, we would have elderly folks or folks who someone was assisting them actually pull up to where we were allowed to stand and say, where's the drop box? And we'd have to say, well, you got to go all the way back around to the front of the school to find the location. And a couple times people were actually pretty upset with us about that. So I guess my question is, who makes that decision of where the drop boxes go? And for the general election, could there be some thought given to placing them closer to where the folks actually are in line or going in? Because I think just naturally, as people are driving and looking, they just go to where they see the people. And so some folks were pretty upset once they had gotten whoever they were assisting out of the car, or they had driven around, and then they kind of left in a huff and puff. And we were just kind of like, sorry, that wasn't our decision. So that was kind of a question, kind of observation. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that. I guess the specific question is, who makes those decisions, and can we rethink that for the general election?
So the local boards make recommendations on the facilities, the locations for them, and they take into consideration accessibility, having it be near a curb cut, where they can allow voters, if it's one that voters can approach on foot, that's accessible to voters who might be in a wheelchair. They look at traffic flow. They, of course, look at what the facility allows them, where they allow them to place them. And also because they have to be under video surveillance, where is there a camera that they can take advantage of in the facility or at the facility that covers the box? So it's a variety of considerations that they make. If you have a specific example, we can certainly, a specific location in Howard County, we can certainly work with the Howard County Board and see if it can be placed somewhere else. They are being delivered this week, so if you can provide that, that would be great. Okay, thank you. Also, I want to follow up on Delegate Long and Delegate Branch's concern. I guess this is more of a comment about the lost hard drives or thumb drives. It was pretty alarming to see that on the news, quite frankly. And I was very concerned about it myself. I heard the comments about there's training that's going into that, but I just want to make sure that the local boards are putting enough safeguards in place, because certainly when we hear something like that on the news, and of course the news is going to make that, you know, the main story during an election. Delegate Long, if you could go on mute, that'd be great. Thank you. Then that goes to transparency. And of course, there's going to be conspiracy theories, and people are going to think, you know, something is going on with our elections, and somebody's messing with our elections. And quite frankly, I don't know enough about technology to say, you know, that's not the case. I understand what you said, Ms. Charleston, about the thumb drive being made and recognized by the device, but I personally don't know if somebody could, you know, get through that. If I was a candidate in one of those jurisdictions, I would have definitely been alarmed and had some problems, possibly with the results of that election. So I think, you know, the local boards and the state boards just should take a look at that and really put some safeguards in place. Because quite frankly, I don't think people should be going home with thumb drives in a bag where we don't know where they're going, and it's election results that folks have taken the time to go and actually vote. So I just wanted to personally say that I found that very alarming, and I hope we take a look at that. I think the very next day I called Stan and was like, what is happening here? My last comment and question is about consolidation. And I'm very concerned about that. I know my colleague from Howard County, Delegate Feldmark, addressed this in her questions, because we had a 30% reduction out here in Howard County where folks can go to vote. I do want to thank our director of the state board, Guy Mickley. He sent me a very long response today because he couldn't be here, and I can share his response certainly with the Howard County folks and with the rest of the committee if they want to take a look at it. But they're doing some work out here in terms of training and stuff, so he couldn't be on today. But my question is, for whatever the reason that there was a consolidation, how come the General Assembly and this committee wasn't notified
And how come the county administration wasn't notified or wherever it took place? This could be, I could be asking my question too early. This could be more for the local folks, but from a state perspective, I think given the law that we just passed, that there should have been some notification there, because the 30% reduction is certainly alarming. You know, some people had to go farther. Some people might not have had the same access that they had to their voting location. I know my parents passed a couple of places that you were able to vote before, and I was kind of like, why are you having to go all the way over there to vote? I mean, they were able to do it, so for them it wasn't a problem, but for others it might have been a problem. And I certainly, you know, there are those instances where you have two polling locations at a school, so it's a cafeteria and a gym. Okay, we can understand that type of consolidation. But other kind of more widespread consolidations, I think, are certainly alarming when we are really talking about access to voting and people exercising their right to vote. So my question more to the point is, why weren't we notified that these types of significant reductions were taking place?
I'm sorry, we didn't realize there was an obligation to report back, and apologize for not being more thoughtful about that.
Okay, those are all the questions and comments I have. I'm just scrolling to make sure there are no other hands up. Okay, so with that, we are going to move on to our local boards. And we have Catherine Berry here from Carroll County, Barbara Wagner from Frederick County, and Allison McLaughlin from Montgomery County. So you can go in any order, but I think Ms. Berry, you're first.
Good morning, committee, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak today with regard to the consolidations. I have sent the committee some documentation that explains and gives more information and context to what I will be talking about today, but I will give a brief overview of the detailed document. So one of the things I think that's important to note is that prior to redistricting, we were starting in Carroll County to notice a decline in people interested in being election judges. This had started prior to 2020, and then it was exacerbated in 2020. So we had a lot of uncertainty with the polling place plan, the number of locations, the election judges that would be needed, when the election would be held, and the election judge training. We also had some other lingering issues with regards to previous election judges quitting because of vacation plans. There were COVID-19 concerns, and the additional new requirement we had in Carroll County was requiring all of our election judges to fill out tax paperwork and provide social security cards in order to be paid as an election judge. So that was a little bit of context, and that all happened and was moving into the redistricting plan. So when redistricting occurred in Carroll County, this was my second redistricting that I had participated in. And this particular redistricting had many more complexities to making changes on the map. We had a very restricted timeline of doing that. And while we were doing redistricting, we were also managing a mass amount, a historic level really, of mail-in ballot applications. So the same amount of staff, the same staff that were helping with redistricting and getting that implemented, were also trying to get all of the mail-in ballot applications put in a timely fashion, while also preparing and recruiting election judges and getting polling place locations prepared. So when we went into redistricting, we had an increase in the amount of precincts. So precincts are determined by your election district lines and the splits, the congressional, legislative, and commissioner district lines. So we had an increase from 36 to 52. 2 precincts were ghost precincts. They had no registered voters in them. and 14 precincts had less than 1,000 voters. So I did provide in all of my documentation a map that indicates polling places that we used in 2018, 2022, and then some of the things that were unavailable and not used for various reasons in my documentation. I apologize. So our average size of precinct went down significantly between 2018 and 2022. And we had previously used 31 polling places in school buildings. 3 of those locations had been hosting 2 precincts in separate locations of the school, like a gym and a cafeteria. In 2018, we also had 2 assisted living facilities that we had been using, but as Nikki mentioned in SBE's testimony, there were COVID considerations that we had to take in as factors. And then in 2018, we had 3 facilities that were either county-owned facilities or fire departments. So in Carroll County, we are very rural. If you haven't driven through, it is a beautiful time of year to come by. But in some of our locations that are very rural, we do not have adequate compliant public buildings that are available for use. So that was one factor. Most of our voters, or all of our voters really, are doing some sort of commute when they go into the shopping districts or into schools in Carroll County. And interestingly enough, you can get from east to west in Carroll County in 33 minutes and north to south in 41. And it has always been, as you can see in the map that I provided, there's always been a short commute to our polling locations. I've also provided to you some heat maps that show voting population diverse communities that is used when we determine early voting centers. So I thought that would be helpful just to kind of overlay those maps and take that into consideration. So in 2022, we had several locations that were not available because of school renovations. In some of these locations, there was no other public building erected and available for use. So there were some that were moved to adjacent precincts. And we had 3 locations that were combined because they were in the same physical location. One location was combined to the larger school because that was adjacent to another polling place. They shared the same parking lot. We also added 4 new locations to the primary election that we had not previously used. So in my written testimony, I did provide a breakdown and a basically an explanation for each of the polling places that was used in 2018 versus 2022. And the other thing I just would like to note, I always have a cost per voter analysis included in my budget paperwork. So I was able to do a quick cost per voter analysis for this election. And I did provide you with the Excel spreadsheet as well as the a chart in the my written testimony. And in general, larger precincts have a smaller cost per voter than smaller precincts do. So the board, when they made the decision to consolidate precincts, I have to reiterate, this is not something that was taken lightly. There was a reality that there was COVID. I think at the time we were dealing with an uptick in COVID. The election judge recruitment had been dropping to a significant level. And the board took all of these things into consideration. So when they ultimately made the decision to reduce the number of polling places, they also made note that the board would be able to consider making changes for 2024 when we have more time to have the staff that have time to identify and work with the new election polling place plan and take into consideration the fact that we had for the first time in Carroll County 3 early voting centers and then mail-in balloting. So on April 29th, after our board meeting, I did send a letter to the State Board of Elections to notify them that the board had made this decision. But I would like to reiterate that there was serious consideration given to all of these factors. And we are still working to recruit election judges. As of yesterday, a front page article in the Carroll County Times ran, we are 128 judges short right now. And I was even quoted in there to say, we can only have in-person voting if we have the election judges to support that. So we are working really hard to make sure that we have these 24 locations fully staffed. And of also note, in 10 years ago, before the last redistricting, the previous election director had consolidated some Carroll County polling places. So we went from 46 locations to 36. And that was 10 plus years ago. We had some of the largest polling places in the state of Maryland, and it had always worked very well. We didn't get any complaints about these consolidations. All of the consolidations were posted on our website because of public notice before the meeting. I also have a communication with my elected officials, the candidates, and the central committees. So I send weekly updates, really. And that information was put out and provided to my elected officials and the candidates. And I was there to answer any questions that they had, but no one had voiced any concern over that. I think I might pause there to answer any questions that you might have to that. And then I can address some of the other questions that have come up if you wish during the first part of the briefing. Thank you very much, Chair Atterbury.
Thank you, Ms. Berry. I'm going to go ahead and let Ms. Wagner and Ms. McLaughlin, and then we'll take questions from everyone. So Ms. Wagner, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Chair, members of the committee. I'm Barbara Wagner, and I am the Frederick County Elections Director. Today, I'm going to discuss what happened regarding post-election canvasses and recounts in Frederick County. As you know, Frederick County, like the other counties, by law was not able to begin mail-in ballot or provisional canvassing until 2 days after Election Day. Frederick County processed 15,500 mail-in ballots and over 1,000 provisional ballots. These numbers represent 17-fold increase over the previous gubernatorial primary in 2018. This year's primary, the canvassing process took 6 full days. We utilized an average of 12 teams of 2 canvassers, as well as most of my staff. And I have a staff of 8 full-time and, 10 full-time and 8 part-time staffers. So while we were preparing for the petition recount in the Democratic primary for the County Councilmanic District 3 contest, we discovered there was a human error in our canvassing. It involved ballot accounting during the mail-in and the provisional canvasses. This includes that what we concluded by this was there was a great probability that there were several batches of ballots that were double scanned or scanned twice in our scanning unit. In addition to that, upon a physical search for provisional ballots, we found 4 provisional ballots that were not introduced in the provisional canvas or any other canvas. And we found those by a judge error. They had actually, as the state has said, attested to that we train our election judges to put different materials in certain places. So when we are getting all those materials back on election day, we know how to process them quickly so we can get all 63 of those polling places in and out, and we can try to upload those results as soon as possible on election night. So there was an issue where an election judge put 4 provisional ballots in a place we were not looking for. And so on part of the recount, that is when we found those 4 additional ballots. So we processed those. So due to the abundance of caution, we had our board of directors decertify our original election. And we went to the process of rescanning all of the provisionals and all of the mail-in ballots on August 10th, I believe, just to be certain, out of a sheer abundance of caution. We wanted to make sure that we had the accurate number. Our early voting numbers were spot on. Our election day numbers were spot on. It was around 96, approximately 96 mail-in ballots that we thought got double scanned, and 4 provisional ballots. So it came up to this number of 100 ballots that we could not account for. After we had rescanned and we recertified the election prior to the state board certifying the election on August 15th, we then again went to process the recount. In the beginning, there was initially in District 3 a 3-vote difference in District 3 contest. After we recertified on August 10th, that difference became a 1-vote difference. The recount we performed and completed made no changes to that recertification number. It was by 1 vote in District 3. So those numbers proved to be correct. So in recapping the primary election events, I just want to point out that the staff and the canvassing teams for Frederick County performed excellent work in an extremely manual process. And you've heard from the state board and you've heard from Carroll County that there was a lot of other things that we were processing at the same time and trying to get everything done within the deadlines and the law. It was a lot of work on our part. So it was an extremely manual process. Additionally, I also wish to acknowledge and thank the staffs of Howard County, Carroll County, Washington County local boards, as well as the State Board of Elections for the assistance and the professional expertise they provided during this time. They provided staff, they provided during the recount and the rescan, they provided a lot of staff from a lot of election officials from a lot of other counties came to help us out, and we really appreciate that. But as a result of our primary election experience, we are planning and implementing processes to address the dramatic increase in voter preferences towards mail-in ballots. As I said, in the gubernatorial, in 2018, we had approximately 1,800 ballots. This year, we're processing 15,500 ballots in the primary, and we expect at least double in the general. So we have streamlined some processes. We've taken best practices from other counties, other larger counties that are getting a lot of mail-in ballots. We've added additional staff. We've created our own mail-in ballot canvas team. And we've had staff do additional training on the voting system and the machines. So I think that's going to help us out a lot going into the general and make us be very successful. Just want to also, the ability to pre-canvass will save us a lot of time as well. We feel like the ability to pre-canvass before early voting will help us with more manageable numbers with the mail-in ballot canvasses. So that will eliminate a lot of the confusion with rescanning and just give us more manageable numbers. We're also implementing a lot of internal controls with our mail-in ballot canvas team, additional reports that will run daily to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So just wanted to provide those brief remarks to you and thank the committee once again for allowing me to speak on our primary election experiences in Frederick County.
Thank you. Next, Ms. McLaughlin.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me speak today. My name is Allison McLaughlin, and I'm the Acting Election Director for Montgomery County. I just want to start by saying that I began my career as a lobbyist for the National Conference of State Legislatures, and I spent more than a decade working in election policy at the federal level before I took a job 12 years ago serving, as I am now, in the trenches as an election administrator. I've been the Acting Election Director in Montgomery County since last December. And I reference my prior experience working at NCSL and tracking these issues nationally in order to say that in my now 22 years of experience in working in elections from both the bird's eye view and the worm's eye view, I've learned that there's really no one right or wrong way to do anything. Any policy that you come up with in the legislature, we can implement, but it takes time. It takes systems development, it takes implementation, and the challenges of moving quickly and moving in a way that looks as though we are improvising in building these processes as we go are so much greater than when we have the lead time to really take a policy, take a process, and implement it in a much more systems-oriented, solution-oriented way leading into a future election. The other jurisdictions around the country were watching us and holding their breath as they saw how quickly we were implementing vote by mail, as we were zigging and zagging and going from vote by mail to vote centers to restoring having every polling place open on election day. And it was quite a strain on the democratic process, on both the actual process of conducting an election and on confidence in that process. We zigged and then we zagged. And it was an upheaval that did not end with the 2020 election, as we had plans in place for the 2022 election, which had us moving in a direction we had never gone before, with a number of polling places that we were going to be going back and opening on election day, on top of having built a vote by mail operation. And then the curveball that we all faced in having the election rescheduled from June to July, as the state board personnel were saying earlier, we had our plans in place for our polling places, and then we effectively lost our lease. At 240 polling places around the county, we had to scramble and find something new. And so while I was not asked to speak to the consolidation of polling places, I will say that I approached redistricting with, I think, the same policy preference, the same concerns that I think many in the legislature had about wanting to make sure that we provided the same number of polling places to our voters in the 2022 election as we had in 2018. It wasn't possible. We tried very hard to have the same number of polling places in 2022 as we had in 2018. And a large part of that is, as Nikki alluded earlier, was because we had school construction that was occurring. And we simply did not have the physical control of these buildings. They did not have AC, or they did not have parking, or they did not have the ability to serve for us as they had in 2018. And that policy choice did lead us to a place where I just had our staff go check precinct 0107 at the Damascus Senior Center. We had 81 voters show up on election day in the primary election. And so that is the flip side of going ahead and implementing a policy choice that we strive as hard as possible to make sure that we have the same number of polling places on election day as we had if there had not been the rise of voting by mail. And of course, in our case as well, a significant increase in the number of early voting sites that we provided. But voters' behavior is changing. And so that is something that the legislature is, I know, going to want to take into consideration, and that we in our plans are going to need to take into account those 81 voters would be the pool from which we would generally draw from in order to recruit election judges. We had trouble recruiting for election judges in that polling place, as you might imagine. So I say that in order to illustrate some of the challenges we face. But in the course of implementing this election and the zigging and the zagging that I alluded to earlier, voters got confused, and the staff who were responsible for managing the process really faced incredible strain as we were calling on our institutions to lurch one way and then the other. And I say all of this in order, I have been asked to answer some specific questions about the recent primary election in Montgomery County, and I will, but I need to frame this discussion by talking about what a transitional state we're in. In Montgomery County, we have thrown out the old playbook. When we moved into our current office space in 2009, we took great pride in the classroom space that we built to train our election judges in and to conduct our canvass process in. Those classrooms are gone. We knocked down the walls, and we've now installed heavy sorting equipment in 2 of them. And the third, which used to be our canvass room, is now the staging area that supports our drop box operation. For our training, for our canvass, we are now in competition with the basketball leagues and the yoga classes and the weddings and all of the other community needs of public facilities in our county in order to book that space, in order to do the work that we need to do in training our election judges or in conducting a canvass. And that's one thing to do for election day. It's another thing maybe to do to reserve a space for 8 days of early voting. It's quite another challenge when we're looking at reserving a space for 6 to 8 weeks to conduct the canvass in addition. And at a certain point, there are strains on the facilities that are available that are a very real challenge as well. So we have reinvented this process as we go, but the task before us and the task that I really want to call on all of you as the policymakers in this state to work with us and lead us in is to charting what the future of Maryland elections is going to look like. I need to know whether we're going to continue to expand early voting. I need to know whether we're going to move to vote centers. I need to know whether we're going to continue to expect to support the same number of traditional polling places on election day that we have before. I need to know whether we're going to make changes in our voting system or whether we're going to continue to preprint millions of preprinted ballots just in case a voter chooses to go to any one of our 14 early voting sites or election day or chooses to vote by mail, where we're preprinting and staging and storing these ballots in our facility. I need to know what kind of physical space we're going to need, and I know what kind of staffing plan I need to put in place for the 2024 election, the 2026 election, and beyond, because we have a capital budget to put together in our county. We have needs. We have to chart these things because improvising is not a good look. So having laid that challenge before you, I want to go ahead and answer some of the questions that you have put before me. I want to say that the 2022 primary election with all of the, and I apologize, I have to turn the lights back on in the room I'm in. There we go. The 2022 election with all of the challenges that we faced was a success story. The process worked. We opened all of our polls on time in Montgomery County. The process was not as efficient or as timely as it should have been. Part of that is because of decisions that I made. I made the decision not to rush our process and to limit our canvass to 8 hours a day because we were understaffed and our staff was overtired and they had work to do before and after the canvass day began and ended. Our office, and I know this is the case in many other jurisdictions as well, was facing the same labor shortage that everyone else is facing in the public and private sectors. We had an effective 20% vacancy rate in our positions really throughout the entire election process. So as we were working to implement all of these things, we faced challenges. We took too long to notify voters that their ballot was received. Delegate Wilkins spoke to the experience with her ballot, and I'm happy to speak to that in detail because I think it gives you a good illustration of the implementation of what we were doing in this election. But we also made errors, and they were errors that our process was designed to catch, which I'm happy to speak to the provisional ballots that were identified later in the process than they ought to have been in order to be counted. But we did catch those errors and the process did work. And the hand recount of ballots cast in the Democratic primary in Montgomery County proved that the scanning equipment was programmed accurately and that the outcome of the election was accurate. I want to echo everything that my colleagues have said earlier. I also want to note, as Katie Berry was indicating earlier, that we really faced a crisis in recruiting election judges for this past election. And that is something that we need to grapple with if we are going to continue to support the scale of in-person voting on election day that we are being asked to at this point. The outpouring of civic interest that gave us such a groundswell of applicants to serve at the polls in 2020 dried up. It was not there for this primary election. And every polling place opened on time, but in many cases, we only had one chief judge and they were understaffed and out of steam by the end of the day. Our results were reported accurately, but they were slow. And you could see those challenges that we faced from the understaffing of our process and the difficulties that we have faced in this labor market. Moving into November, our team feels much better about the level of interest that we're seeing in serving as an election judge, so fingers crossed about that. And we have done some things to maximize our staffing, including doing some things we had never done before, like hiring part-time personnel for some tasks that we have always required full-time personnel for, to have some floater staff to assist in a variety of ways when we have a greater than our past experience has led us to turnover in those roles. We're working with the State Board of Elections on the next phase of implementing our new ballot sorting equipment to improve the efficiency of the process and reduce the delays in notifying voters that we received the ballot. So, for example, Delegate Wilkins raised the example earlier of her ballot, and when I first started in Montgomery County, we physically alphabetized voters' ballots by last name within their precinct. And it was all done by fingertips as we took in those ballots. Our receipt of ballots was as they came in the door, and then we organized them for the canvass entirely manually. That worked when we had 5,000 absentee ballots, when we had 6,000 absentee ballots. It didn't work when we had 20,000 absentee ballots or 30,000 absentee ballots. And it sure isn't going to work with 150,000 absentee ballots. So we needed to have a sorting system that was going to work for us, especially with the new implementation of reporting results for early voting and vote by mail by precinct. And the ballot sorting equipment that we have purchased is wonderful. It does its job in terms of sorting ballots by precinct, but it is going to take us time to make sure that we have a full integration of that sorting equipment with MD voters so that we are able to take the receipt of that voter's ballot and have that information not only communicated up into MD voters, but also building in the reporting systems that we need in order to track a ballot through the entirety of its process. What happened in the 2020 primary election for us was that we had an initial upload of the first 3,000 ballots that we had received. And when we uploaded those ballots into MD voters, it broke those ballots out into, I think it was 956 different batches of ballots. We can't take a batch of ballots that is one ballot, 2 ballots, 3 ballots through the entirety of our process and track it in a meaningful way, in the way that we are accustomed to. And so we either needed to completely reconfigure, redesign all of our process in order to work with what we had, or we needed to do what we ultimately did, which was to take each of those ballots, these batches of 1 ballot, 2 ballots, 3 ballots. And over time, as we received additional ballots for that precinct, we scanned them manually into the batches that were created initially. We chose to do that because it was the process that had worked for us in the past. Our lowest unit of a batch going through the entire process that we can track of 50 ballots. In the case of Delegate Wilkins' ballot, we had a batch for her precinct that had been created. When we received her ballot, when we received your ballot, Delegate Wilkins, we scanned that ballot into a batch that we were unable to close out for a period of time. And so we had a technology implementation that was in a very in-between state where we had to move quickly in order to implement it for the primary election. We have identified a way that we are going to prevent that particular challenge of needing to close a batch, open a batch, close a batch, open a batch. That was very time consuming and really slowed down our process and contributed to our situation where we had a lag of 2 to 3 weeks before voters were receiving notification that their ballot had been received. And we've worked out the kinks on that part of it. But there are still pieces of it that are going to take us some time to build. We have our staff working aggressively with the state board, working with the other jurisdictions that are implementing the sorting equipment. I think anybody who's ever been involved in a technology implementation will tell you that it takes some time in order to work out all of the kinks on that. But as with so much else in the elections process, we go slowly with it because we need to make sure that it's done right. And we need to make sure that there's really no margin for error. And so I apologize for the delay that you faced in having your ballot noted as received and that so many other voters faced as well. But it was done in the interest of making sure that we had an accurate accounting of all of our ballots so that we were ultimately able to catch something like those 102 provisional ballots at the end that had not been accounted for and that we needed to go back and scan. Other issues that I was asked to speak to, the recount. I'm happy to give you specific costs of any of the individual items in a recount, but I think the most important takeaway for you is the opportunity cost. A recount is something that we are by law not allowed to use election judges for. It is something that we have to use only our professional staff for. And so how much we pay those professional staff is really not so much the issue as the fact that they are unable to perform the other duties that they would normally be doing during that time if they are sitting in a recount room. And so that there was certainly, because we needed to do a recount, that took what was already a very tight timetable in turning around from a postponed primary election to the fixed date of the general election, which pushed back, of course, our ability to have the ballot be finalized, to be doing all of the work to prepare for the general election that we normally would. And I was asked to speak to the ballot marking devices, but I really think that that has already been covered. I will just note that the ballot marking devices are incredibly popular in Montgomery County, and voters are looking for the opportunity to be able to use that touchscreen. We have lines to use it. And so we are, but I really need to defer to the state board as far as the processes that they've already outlined to do any sort of upgrade or the timetable that we have for where we will be looking at any other equipment for use in the state of Maryland. I know there were other questions, and so I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. So I see Delegate Rose, and then we'll move to Delegate Wilkins. Delegate Rose?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for your on-the-ground feedback. It's very helpful. I know that I have great communication with Katie Berry here in Carroll County, and I do want to applaud her. One thing I wanted to also point out, and I don't know if this was the case, and I don't think it was the case in every jurisdiction, we not only had to deal with the federal redistricting, we also had the state redistricting, and then locally, we had to deal with our commissioner redistricting, which only happens once every, certain amount of years. So I appreciate the communication and the difficulty of pulling all of those three moving parts together and trying to figure out a way to find precincts and locations that satisfied all three of those challenges. So I really do want to applaud you for that. I believe you said, and I just wanted to reiterate, I can say as a delegate, I did not get one complaint from any constituent about concerns with our voting. And so I believe that's my first question for our director. And I'd be curious as to the other jurisdictions as far as the number of complaints, but I did not get any. And even with the challenges, I think I took notes pretty quickly when you were speaking, but can you speak to, I guess, number one, the complaints, if we had a lot, and number two, our general turnout stats. I think I saw it looked like we still had a pretty good turnout overall, even with all of the challenges. So could you kind of address those?
Sure. Thank you, Delegate Rose, for those questions. That's right. I did not have any complaints or concerns prior to the board making the decisions or thereafter. The turnout I thought was interesting. The 2018 primary election turnout was around 20%. And in 2022, we were around 29% turnout. So it was an increase in the total turnout. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I guess just to conclude, not really a follow-up, just a question moving forward. So again, I really appreciate all of the local boards' input about the implementation, and I appreciate everything that you've done. I would just wonder if, as we move forward, just as a committee in general, you know, as we adapt and move forward, if we can really bring the locals in, just so that we know that we are giving allowances for the localities, because we all come from different areas. And I know you discussed the rural area aspect of what we deal with. And then also, I really appreciate Ms. McLaughlin and talking about the budgeting. And so I think we all want great, wonderful elections. So hopefully we can all work together closely to make sure we're able to, you know, move that forward in the best way for our voters, our localities, and our budgets. So thank you all very much for the presentation. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Delegate Wilkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do want to start by thanking and praising my own county, Montgomery County, who had the largest number of mail-in ballots. And it took several days and weeks to be able to count. And by the time we did our certification, our recount, a lot of time and effort and energy had gone into that, but I think overall it was very smooth and successful. So do want to thank you for your leadership, Allison, and just shout out and thank all of our Montgomery County election officials and of course those statewide. I have a question for just all of the local boards with something that I observed, which is that I know of one or two people who wanted to be election judges, and they reached out. One person in particular applied to 3 different jurisdictions. So this is not about any particular jurisdiction, but was not able to hear back. So I know that several of you have mentioned and talked about the lack of availability of judges and recruitment. And I'm wondering how much of that is that people that were having trouble recruiting and not able to gain the interest and participation of judges, or our processes with so much going on, the capacity to actually respond to and train those folks. Because I know people who didn't want to be judges, and they just did not hear back.
And I'll be happy to start on that one. And I'm familiar with the case you're describing. We discussed it of a one person who had applied to multiple counties in the interest of serving. And in that case, it was one where it was someone whose voter record had an address change, and what we had on file did not match what they had put in their election judge application because they were in the process of moving or had moved. And so on our end, we had sort of sorted it into a stack that was not the stack, that was the area of focus. And so there are certainly circumstances where we are slower than we ought to be in responding to an individual who is eager and ready to serve. And when I go back and track it through, there's some reason why something is sitting on somebody's desk, because they're like, oh, I was going to get to that stack. Oh, I was gonna was not maybe their priority or their area of focus. And so we were ultimately able to get that person into a position where they were able to get signed up for a class and to move forward in the process. Overall, I would say that our biggest challenge, and this is not unique to this election, it's just particularly acute in an election like this one, is that it does not occur to people to sign up to serve as an election judge until the weeks right before an election. And so we faced, as in this election, as we always do, a really significant increase in the number of applications that we are receiving just as early voting is starting. And we have more or less stopped training because our trainers are the same people who are running the early voting sites. And so what I really need, and our recruiters, have a process that they need to follow in terms of assigning people. And so while we are certainly scrambling, and we did something unprecedented for us this time, which was that we set up a brand new category of sort of a floater election judge that did not get the hands-on time with the equipment that we normally would want every election judge to experience, where we assigned them to lesser roles where they weren't going to be working with the equipment, simply in order to get some of those last minute applicants in the door and able to serve, even though we were not able to get them the hands-on training that we wanted them to have. So we did our best to apply some creative solutions. But everything that we can do in order to get people to sign up now, and most importantly, actually sign up for and take their election judge training classes now, and not to be one of the last minute applicants who is applying when we have, maybe 3 classes left that we can fit 120 people into, and now suddenly we've got 3,000 applicants.
And I think I will add to Allison's comments. We always seem to have an influx of people that want to serve as election judges from certain areas of the county. And then all of those positions are filled. Some folks don't want to go across the county to another polling place to serve. That is a challenge. One of the other challenges, as Allison mentioned, there are a lot of last minute people that want to come in, and we are challenged to have the staff to be able to train adequately during early voting, or even the week between or the weekend between early voting and election day. Historically, and I was an election judge recruiter before I was a director, we had 50 to 75 election judges quit within the 3 days before election day. And so we were challenged to find replacements for those. The other observation that I've seen more now than before is once we start outlining for volunteers that it is a long day, they have to be committed to setting up the polling place the day before, coming in the day of, working all day. Once they find that out, and then they have to give the tax paperwork, a lot of them are saying, no, thank you. So that, I think, is a significant challenge. The other challenge looking forward to the general election and beyond is when we're doing that recruitment concurrently with counting mail-in ballots and preparing for early voting. So we will need election judges to help us with the mail-in ballots in addition to those other things. So they are challenges that we will get worked out.
Delegate Wilkins, did you have any other questions?
No more questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Any other questions from the committee members? Okay, I just based on what everyone had mentioned, I just want to remind folks, if you have issues with Dropbox locations in your county that you've noticed, please get them in. Since I think Ms. Charleston said they're about to be delivered, let the state board know today what your concerns might be, maybe powwow with folks from your jurisdiction, and then send in one main list. I think that's really important. In terms of election judges, I would just make the recommendation that, there are a lot of organizations out here. I belong to various civic organizations, and I know some other members of our committee do, where, some of our main national focus is elections and something, sort of related to politics and getting people out to vote. So approaching those type of organizations earlier than closer to the election, then those groups and churches and other organizations might be able to designate people that'll probably just stay those people for each election. And they can be trained and they'll continue to show up. I think it's not on people's radar until it is on people's radar. And so unless, the election's that week, then it might occur to them. But if there's some type of outreach, I think that particularly in the larger jurisdictions, I'm suggesting it's not going to be that hard to find people to serve at election judges. My last comment is, I think that this issue of consolidation, wherever we are on it, you thought consolidation was great, or, if you stand where I am, and I thought it was not a great thing. I mean, I think regardless, we passed legislation, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to have this briefing. And so the law was actually not to consolidate, quite frankly. And I do want to commend Ms. Berry for reaching out to your local elected officials and posting things on your website. And at least there was that form of communication there. We did not see that in my county, where there was a 30% reduction. So I think to us, after passing policy, as Ms. McLaughlin said, she's looking to us to pass the policy. Well, we did pass a policy, and we said we don't want any consolidation. There has to be the same amount of polling places and precincts as there were previously, and that just didn't happen. So if there is going to be the same amount of consolidation in the general election, I would ask that you let this committee know, so that we're aware of that. But I think it's the thought of the General Assembly that we need to follow the law that we passed. So those are my closing remarks. We are 1 minute past the 2 hours here. I want to thank the committee members. It's good to see all of you, even if it's on Zoom. And I want to thank all of the local folks for participating today, and all of the folks at the state level. So thank you.